Lisa, can you hear?
I could hear you for just a second there.
Hi, Lisa.
Hello. Yeah, I can hear you just fine. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I'm seeing that my video won't start because the host has stopped it, it says.
Oh, your video of, oh, okay, interesting. Let me see. Chat. Let me see if I make you co-host, then there we go.
That should work. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, I can't see myself yet, but yeah.
Oh, and there's Mallory. Hello.
Hi. Oh, I need to put on my sign to speak up background. And then do you want me to be doing the tech or live tweeting or?
I would love you to do the tech if you can.
Okay.
And I have these slides that I'm currently sharing. But actually, maybe it's easier if you share from your computer.
I'm not going to be able to share because it crashes my computer.
Right. Okay. I think I'll just share this first slide, and then Paul, are you able to share from your computer for your
little? Let me try it. Hang on.
Yeah. You might have to stop and share it.
Well, still working on setting this up. Just give me a minute.
No worries. Looks like we have a few people joining already. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes.
There, are you seeing that now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. You want me to leave it up here, or should I stop and for now so that you can introduce and so on?
Let's, why don't I share my screen at the beginning just with this.
Okay.
But it was easy enough to pull up.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I have your slides here too, just in case, but I feel like it's probably easier for you to kind of be able to move through them without having to say next slide every time.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Great. Oh, and Katharine's joining as well.
Hello.
Hello.
Weirdly, it says I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it.
Yes, I'm on it. I have to make you a co-host, I think.
Got it.
Shoot, that I'm not seeing that option coming up actually. Do you know, Mallory?
Yeah, here, let me look.
Katharine, did you join using the link that was sent specifically to you?
It basically said, "Hi, Katharine Mach, you were invited to a Zoom webinar. Click here to join." And I clicked there.
Okay.
There, now you're a co-host.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Wonderful. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Yeah, thank you both.
Should we try our screen share before everything gets going, or?
Yes, so we got Paul's to work properly. If you want to try, here, I'll stop my screen share really fast.
Seem okay?
Yeah.
Good. Perfect.
Great. It is 11 a.m. We have about 21 people so far. I think we should hold out a little bit longer and see. We had a lot of RSVPs, so I'm excited for the crowds today. Oh, Mallory, are you trying to say something?
Yeah, we were close to 200 RSVPs, I think. So we should give people a second because I think they will be coming. They just are a couple of minutes late. Yeah.
I can see the number climbing. Katharine, you used to go by Katie. Have you converted to Katharine, or can I call you Katie?
Please call me Katie.
Okay.
And basically we'll go Paul's presentation, my presentation, then Q&A flow.
Yes, that's the plan.
Great.
We'll keep this relatively informal. I see we have 43 people here already. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll get started in just a couple moments.
Having trouble with this camera app.
You're very large, Paul.
You don't really want to see me that close.
Go back to this. Well, I see that the participant number is still climbing. Should we give it one more minute and then we'll get started? Okay. Oops.
It's flattening out. We should get going.
Yeah, I think so too. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's fantastic to see so many people on this call right now. We have about 65 people listening in. And I want to first introduce myself and our group Scientists Speak Up. My name is Elisa Bowles, and I am one of the co-presidents of Scientists Speak Up, along with Mallory Harris here. We are a group on campus focused on providing students training in communicating science beyond the walls of academia, and especially in combating misinformation around scientific topics ranging from climate change to COVID vaccines. I'm thrilled to be joined today by two lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report, Katharine Mach and Paul Edwards. And just by way of introduction, Katharine Mach is an associate professor at the University of Miami, Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, and a faculty scholar at the Abbas Center, focused on environmental science and policy. Her research assesses climate change risks and response options to address increasing floods, extreme heat, wildfire, and other hazards. She served as the IPCC's Working Group 2 co-director during the 5th assessment report, and is a lead author for the upcoming 6th Working Group 2 assessment report, as well as a chapter lead for the US 5th National Climate Assessment. She is the 2020 recipient of the Piers Seller Prize for world-leading contribution to solution-focused climate research. And she received her PhD from Stanford and previously acted as director of the Stanford Environment Assessment Facility. Paul Edwards is director of the Stanford Program in Science, Technology, and Society, and William J. Perry Fellow and Senior Research Scholar at the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. He studies the history, politics, and culture of information infrastructures, especially climate knowledge systems. He's written several books on the subject, including A Vast Machine, Computer Models, Climate Data, and the Politics of Global Warming, which won several awards and was named Book of the Year by The Economist magazine in 2010. He served as lead author of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC's Working Group 1, The Physical Science Basis, released this past August. So thank you all so much again for joining. I will now turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and give a brief introduction on the history of the IPCC and the dynamics of the assessment report process. After that, we will transition to a more informal conversation. So please have your questions ready, post them in the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Without further ado, Paul, do you want to take it over?
Sure. Okay, so let's see, that seems like it didn't do what I wanted it to do. Hang on. Always like this.
We're still figuring out our Zoom technology even a year and a half
there.
later.
So you should be seeing a slide showing 140 years of climate data in 30 seconds. I'm going to start this slide. And you can see this visualization. This is not a model. This is a visualization of the instrumental temperature record of the world since the 1880s. And what you are watching is the industrialization of the planet and the growth in use of fossil fuels for our industrialized world. And you can see its effects very clearly right up to the present. And of course, we're going to go past that in the future. So, you know all about this. I'm sure everybody has seen these kinds of records come up. That this is the warmest decade on record. 2020 was the warmest year on record. In July 2021, just a couple of months ago, was the hottest month on record. So we're definitely heating up. Okay, so I'm just going to speak very briefly about what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is and what it does and how it works. And Katie will take over after that and tell us some more about those things. So the IPCC was established in 1988. It was always conceived as an input to what was expected to be a framework convention on climate change, which was finally drafted and signed in 1992. It is an assessment report, so it is not primary research. The IPCC does not have labs or research facilities. It does not create any models. It relies on the published scientific literature and a few other things. Almost all of what it considers is the previously peer-reviewed literature in scientific publications. The membership also changes to a degree between each assessment cycle and each report. So it's not always the same people. It's not an organization that has a kind of constant persistence as the same people doing the same things over and over again. So I was new in the most recent round. I worked on working group 1, which is the physical science basis. That's the report that just came out in August. There are 2 other working groups. One is on impacts and adaptation and vulnerability. That's the one Katie's in this time, working group 2. And then there's also a working group on mitigation, which is how we can reduce the amount of climate change that's coming, and many kinds of policy options for doing things. IPCC is supposed to be policy neutral. That is, it can suggest different pathways, but it's not supposed to promise that any particular one is the right one. We don't evaluate that. We just look at what is going on, what's it going to do to us, and how we can slow it down. So what's the process like? Well, so I was new to this in July of 2018 when the working group 1 began its process, and I thought, oh boy, so we're having this meeting and we're going to have a few months to write our first draft. But no, we had to turn in a first draft by the end of August of 2018. So it moves very, very quickly. We reviewed over 14,000 scientific papers, the large majority of them previously published and peer-reviewed, and the large majority published since the last report in 2013. The way it works is that first we created an internal draft. That's the one that had to happen by August. Then everybody in the organization can review that and comment on it. Then from that set of comments, we create a first order draft. That one is reviewed by everyone working on the report and outside experts. Outside experts basically means anyone who signs up. So the IPCC will accept your self-declaration of expertise. And in principle, they could turn people down, but in practice, they really don't. So most of the comments we got from these experts were in good faith and really, really helpful, but we do get a few occasional cranks who just take pot shots. The second order draft, produced by revision of the first order draft after this comment process, is then reviewed again by the IPCC membership and by outside experts, and now by governments who are technically members of the IPCC. The governments don't write the report. They're not allowed to do that because that would be a kind of politicization of the process. But some of the government representatives know a good deal about climate science, and so their comments can be really quite helpful. And then finally, there is a final government draft and a summary for policymakers, which summarizes the whole report. And that document, much shorter than the actual report, usually 30, 40 pages, that is approved by governments line by line at an excruciating meeting that lasts a week or so. This time had to be done on Zoom. So a little bit about the numbers here. So the lead authors included 234 people from 65 countries. There were also many contributing authors who contributed anything from a phrase or a sentence to a paragraph and might have comments on things that we did. You can see that we're still top heavy with men, but 30% of the members were new this time. 78,000 review comments received on working group 1 alone, and comments from 46 countries on the final government distribution. The last thing I want to say is that this process is extremely transparent now. So what you see on the left there is that in the previous report, the draft is published and the comments and responses, not the names of the people who commented, but the comments and what was done to respond. Every comment must receive a response. That's the IPCC rule. And if you reject a comment, you have to say why. If you accept a comment, you have to say what you did to respond to that comment. So this is the most intensive peer review process ever in the history of science, and by a long shot. You're welcome to go and consult these pages and see what happens during a review. And that's all I have to say for now, so I'll turn it over to Katie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alyssa, for introducing us and bringing us all together. And thank you, Paul, for that great intro. I will hit just a few quick themes that are deeply complementary to what Paul has already described. First, I'll start by positioning the IPCC in this broader landscape of assessment. So when it comes to decision-making, policy-making on a large range of environmental issues, whether it's the global climate or global considerations of biodiversity or local considerations in terms of adapting cities or issues unique to the private sector or the Arctic, you name it, there are a large number of these ongoing assessment processes. The IPCC might be the most well-developed, longest standing, and largest in terms of the number of participants as Paul described. But across all of these different examples of experts coming together to try to make knowledge more accessible to decision-making processes, I think of them as having a lot of similarities across the different processes reflected in the image here on the right. Number one, that when it comes to almost any issue of importance to societies, it's imperative to draw from many different disciplines, lines of evidence, modes of inquiry. It's not enough just to rely on a single line of evidence when it comes to, what do we know about climate risks that need to be managed right now? So oftentimes some of the evidence is grounded in the world as it has existed, empirical evidence, observations, that slide that Paul started with the temperature record, for example. There's a lot about inferring drivers, predictors, understanding processes and interactions pursued through statistics, models, and experiments, as well as increasingly when it comes to responses, we're seeing across those lines of evidence a lot of work as well as deep lessons being learned across contexts of, for example, early efforts to reduce emissions of heat-trapping gases or prepared for impacts that are in the pipeline. In all of these processes, as Paul described, it's iterative. There are ongoing interactions saying what questions are relevant to decision making right now. How can the state of knowledge be made relevant and usable? With a wide range of products coming out, but importantly, this process of interaction over the course of years of developing an assessment might be the most crucial factor, making sure that people leave the process with a clear understanding of state of knowledge and how that frames or shapes or prioritizes options moving forward. Paul gave a wonderful introduction of how the IPCC works. I'll emphasize 4 themes that to me jump out as essential in terms of how the IPCC process works. Number 1 is the mandate for the assessment to be comprehensive. I think all of us, when we hear a scientific expert on the evening news, often they're talking about a latest study that's come out, something where it has been their work, their baby, and they're basically saying, here's what we've learned from this one particular new advance. By contrast, when it comes for assessment to inform policymaking and decision-making broadly, the mandate is to step away from your own work as if it is the best and greatest thing out there and to look across all of the knowledge on any given topic. As Paul described, these next 3 aspects are really key. Those multiple rounds of basically monitored, refereed scientific review, absolutely crucial towards pushing towards that comprehensive view, not just what one author thinks, but what many hundreds to thousands of reviewers feel may be necessary to encompass. Third, as Paul described, this consensus approval process by governments, the best of times, the worst of times. I'll get to that a little bit more in the next slide. And then lastly, is this mandate in the IPCC context to be relevant to ongoing decision making, but not to prescribe what should be done. And for me, this last one is really interesting in that it's an assumption that there's a difference or a bright line between informing policy and putting the should in terms of what should be done. But I think where IPCC gets tricky, Where approval gets tricky is the fact that there's really no clear boundary between being relevant and speaking to what should happen. And oftentimes the role of values, whether it's how you value human life or think about the balancing of priorities, goes far beyond science in a way that sometimes science is actually tackling, but not necessarily in fully transparent ways. And I really love that richness that gets surfaced in assessment. So to these approval processes, they're line by line, as Paul described. The top image is a co-chair working with two authors and me as a director of science on the podium in a classic moment where the hundreds of government delegates out in the audience have given a lot of feedback on a given statement, areas of confusion, questions about whether it's really what we know right now. And on the podium, we're trying to figure out what is a revision to that material that would keep it accurate, but address the many issues that have been raised. These are very formal UN-style sessions, and there are a range of mechanisms to get to consensus. It doesn't usually happen naturally in terms of all 300 to 500 people at once coming to conclusion, especially on the harder issues. And so this bottom image is one of the less formal mechanisms of resolving an issue, and this is what's called a huddle or a breakout. And we basically have a lot of different governments represented at the center of that circle, hashing it out on a particular sentence with in this case, the experts who authored the report, some very prominent ones, peering in over the shoulders of the government delegates at the center there. The last thing I'll end with, since I know we'll be hitting on COP26, is that in the last round, there was a very unique role of the assessment, in particular in informing the temperature goal in the Paris Agreement, pursuing 1.5, keeping warming well under 2 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial levels. And again, as Paul described, many thousands of publications and a deliberate assessment process through key risks most deserving of society's attention, reasons for concern at the global scale, and then an ongoing multi-year structured dialogue between authors of the report and negotiators working on the Paris Agreement ended up with a very clear role of science in informing the ambition of that target. So that's all I've got. And Lisa, back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul and Katharine, for a great introduction to the IPCC and the review process. We have a couple questions coming in already in our Q&A, and please continue to post, everyone. And I think the one that Annalise posted is a really great follow-up to what you were talking about. So I'm wondering if you can discuss a little bit more what this process has been like for you to be involved in particular, all these multiple rounds of revisions and review and the different actors at play. Annalise is asking specifically about why governments are so involved in the process. She says, it seems like this introduces a risk of governments pushing for their own self-interest instead of reflecting the science. What are the benefits and necessities of this? Maybe Paul, if you want to start off here.
Yeah, I'll start, and Katie will have more to say than I do, because I wasn't involved in the Summary for Policymakers process. So that's where most of that negotiating of statements happens. Why are governments involved? Well, remember, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it is an organization of governments, and its role is to advise the United Nations, which is also an organization of governments. So IPCC is sponsored by the United Nations, the Environment Program, and the World Meteorological Organization. Those are so the WMO is an arm of the United Nations. It's not a political arm. Environment Program has more politics involved, but both of those things, the focus here is on getting the best possible science advice from scientists, but the advice is for governments. So that's why they're involved. And Katie can talk more about the negotiating process, but I'll just say that governments don't draft the body of the report. They can comment on it, but they do not write anything that goes into that part. What happens then is that the Summary for Policymakers is written, which boils down these multi-thousand-page documents into a handful of points. And that's and the question that governments are asked to answer at the summary session is, does the summary reflect the underlying science presented in the main body of the report? And that's where there's wiggle room and why it's complicated to address those things. So over to Katie.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Paul. And really a good question. I'm almost going to just back up to reflect on some of the broader themes before diving back into the contested and difficult consensus approval process and why it exists. The broader point that I think is crucial to recognize, as Paul described, the role of this process is to help make science usable for policymaking, so that there is advice coming from scientific perspectives and informing issues of concern, what reasonable targets might be, nature of the risks, nature of the options. You could say that there are a lot of different conceptions of the relationship between science and society, or science and policy. And some of them, especially kind of coming out of traditional scientific, disciplinary silos, will often pretend as if there's like a boundary of, there's a role in a world of science and a role in a world of policy, and kind of things fly from one realm to the other. But I think really much of the understanding of how science and policy and science and society interact over time has recognized that unless there are discrete, clear opportunities for people to interact across these spheres of science and policy, there will be very little effective movement of knowledge into decision-making processes. So in a way, that's kind of the role of the IPCC, as Paul described, like the panel of the Intergovernmental Panel is governments, and scientists are participating in the process to provide that advice. I would say in terms of why in the world does this totally insane process of the line-by-line approval exist, what's wild about it is that at the end of that process, all 300 government delegates in that room go home with total understanding of each sentence in the document, right? So if you were to kind of pick up an IPCC summary and just read it, even if for a scientist like me, it's dense, right? It's hard to understand the current state of knowledge on these issues. But if you've taken a sentence that's a hard sentence and had a 3-hour discussion about it, usually everyone in the room gets the science. So it's a difficult process. I actually did a very in-depth study asking, how do these documents actually change through the approval process? What we see for the most part is a lot of explanation is added through the edits made in an approval process. So warming is unequivocal. Like, what do you mean by unequivocal? Things like that, unpacking the scientific language, and also kind of in a similar way, adding a lot of examples. So going from very abstract scientific statements that we as scientists love, it's all encompassing, to illustrating what is meant. And in the end, every single delegate can go home and explain the document and the state of science right now in their own domestic context across 195 plus governments. So it's not an easy process, but I think it's a process that has been transformational for governments, but then also the way that these documents then for media, for community organizations, for the private sector also really play a catalytic role in shaping current understanding.
Thank you both for those excellent answers. We have a number of other fantastic questions coming in. So following up on that, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how the IPCC assessment has evolved over time from one kind of assessment report to the next. There's a question from Kathy Burke about whether the IPCC report looks back at its most recent past reports to assess the impact of that question and how things have evolved. And I think kind of adding on to that, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to some of the sixth assessment report's key findings and how that state of scientific knowledge has shifted over time since the last report, and sort of what the implications are for, the future of our planet and our survival. Feel free, either one of you, to start.
Paul, you want to jump in first?
Well, let's see. So Katie's question about, Kathy Burke's question about looking back at previous reports. Well, in Working Group one report, we do that in the first chapter, which is the chapter I worked on. not quite the way you asked the question, which is, do we look at the impact of the previous report? But what we did do is to try to place the previous report in a kind of historical context. What was learned and what was the conclusion, what were the key conclusions of the last report before we move on to talk about what's been learned since then. So, impact of the reports, that I think in a lot of ways that would be outside the scope of what the IPCC is doing, because we're trying to analyze the scientific findings since the previous report. We've got another question here about, which is kind of similar, about do we analyze potential pathways and solutions? When we do that, do we consider practical considerations like how much it would cost? There may be some of that in working groups 2 and 3, but there's nothing about costs of potential solutions in working group 1. The point is of the reports is to lay out a series of potential pathways that humanity could follow. And really, the questions about cost are questions for politics. They're questions about what governments can do and are able to do in their own circumstances. Let me just say one word about another question that's here, because I think it's really a good one. Thinking about indigenous and historically marginalized communities, how are they represented? Well, this was a very difficult question for Working Group 1, because we treat the physical science of climate, and we do it in a Western scientific mode, which means that we consider mainly what can be measured, what has been measured with instruments and proxy data and anything else where there is actually data. Indigenous knowledge is in principle an independent line of evidence for the IPCC. But integrating indigenous knowledge with Western modes of science is really complicated, because indigenous people know a lot about their weather and at least their recent climates within the last few generations. Possibly much longer than that. There have been some studies of Australian indigenous myths that suggest that they do have a historical memory going back 25,000 years to when they were able to walk, because the sea level was lower from elsewhere in that area to the continent of Australia. But there was really not much consideration of indigenous knowledge in Working Group 1, and that may be different in the other working groups.
Great. Okay, I was taking a lot of notes on different angles to follow up on there across these different themes. So, kind of jumping to the evolution of IPCC assessment through time, and really kind of the state of knowledge, the state of climate change through time. The way I see the trajectory, as I was kind of just trying to chart it out, would be that at the start of the IPCC in 1988, in a way, there was kind of a hope that climate change could be avoided. That yes, some warming had already occurred, but that this is largely something that could be taken seriously and addressed. So in a way, the assessment was largely about kind of a future-oriented look at the potential for warming, and broadly speaking, what could be done about it. In those early days, in the early 90s, this word adaptation, which means kind of adjusting to climate and its effects, preparing, increasing resilience. In the early 90s, adaptation was a dirty word. It basically was viewed as something that would take away attention from reducing emissions of heat-trapping gases, responses that are viewed as addressing the root of the issue. But through time, as the decades have transpired, we've gone from climate change as something that might happen in the future to increasingly a world where we can detect our influence on the climate system, where warming is unequivocal, and now where we have exceeded 1 degree Celsius temperature increase since pre-industrial times. We've also gone increasingly from a world, for example, in the third assessment report, where there were just a few dots on the maps, where we could say our emissions of heat-trapping gases have already caused impacts for agriculture or water security or urban regions or rural regions, to now a world where the map is completely dotted with examples of impacts for people and nature now. And now in the AR6, for the first time, a real emphasis on the degree to which we can also now dot that map with examples of responses that are happening in terms of the so many different ways that emissions are being reduced and impacts are being grappled with in real time. That history has been reflected, yes, in the reports themselves, as Paul described, and also in a very large body of literature and scholarship that's often called assessing assessments. So oftentimes the scientific community itself adds the most insight on how the process is evolving through scholarship that is directly focused on this process of assessment to inform policymaking. And then the last thing I would emphasize, absolutely in the space of impacts and adaptation, there is a phenomenal attention to the way that scientific knowledge, as traditionally defined, creates power hierarchies through the world, issues of inclusion and exclusion. In the Working Group 2 report, there have been many different figures that increasingly say, what is the amount of publications available on these issues across each global region? And we've got orders of magnitudes of differences in terms of how many papers do we have on climate change impacts in Europe versus South America, or Europe versus Africa. We know a lot more, and that basically embeds like a positivistic bias where we're much more able to talk about the things that have been studied, where the things that have been studied are not necessarily a perfect reflection of what is actually happening. So simultaneously, we're seeing a real emphasis on different knowledges, different worldviews, and also kind of the concepts of decolonizing science and making sure science more so doesn't just replicate these inequities of the past as well.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I think these questions of, whose voices are we including and how we create equity in this process are really important. And I'm wondering, kind of jumping off of that, more broadly, what do you see as sort of the limitations of the IPCC as it stands? Where are opportunities to improve this process and make it more equitable, make it more powerful as a tool for policymakers and change makers around the world? How can we be doing our science better?
Katie, I've been starting, so why don't you start on this one? And
I've been liking following, but okay, I'll start. So I think what I would say is that, there are a few key features of the IPCC that you could kind of simultaneously see as its strengths and its limitations. So number one, being a consensus-based process. That is not only for the summaries for policymakers, as we've been describing, it's also for making any adjustments to how the IPCC works. So guess what? If you have a consensus-based process, you change slowly by definition. That is in a way a strength in that it creates predictability, and it's a weakness in that it's not really able to rapidly or nimbly adjust how it functions as an organization. So we've seen major improvements in how communications are handled in the IPCC, or how a diversity of products are handled in the IPCC. We see a lot of emphasis on inclusion because it is consensus by every government of the world. That's the strength of that consensus process. But for example, we see limits in terms of nimbleness. It might be the case that, and some have argued that you could imagine moving away from these full-blown comprehensive reports and instead towards more nimble special topic reports called special reports that are directly responsive to issues cracked open and doing deep dives on, whether it's the ice sheets or wind power. You could name a lot of different issues where a deep dive would be helpful and more empowering for decision-making across different scales. It's almost impossible to move away from the comprehensive assessments, and it's for reasons of equity, which are really quite legitimate in that, for example, the US, we've got the National Climate Assessment. Most developed countries have nationally based assessment processes. Most low-income countries do not, and the IPCC is their assessment at a national level as well. There are also some questions about kind of this being a whole lot of work for nothing. I think the way I think about it is that certainly what the IPCC has done very, very well is provide framing for these issues where we overall right now on our understanding of the climate challenge. What it does less well is respond to decision-making needs at every scale, level of government, some of the enduring challenges. So I think viewing the IPCC as the be-all, end-all is incorrect, and instead it's kind of one piece in this very large constellation of climate science for climate action at this point?
Yeah, well said. It's a very complex process. The reports are extremely dense, and they're thousands of pages. Most people will never read them. The summaries for policymakers get far more attention than the bodies of the reports. But what the reports do, it's important for the science, is to kind of document the progress that we've made over these last 30 years in understanding the climate system. So at the time of the first report, the understanding was strictly global. There was not a whole lot of knowledge about what would happen to any particular place. And over time, with better models and a lot more data, we've been able to get much closer to saying, here's what's going to happen to you in your region, in your country. So I posted an item in the chat about the interactive atlas that Working Group 1 has, which cuts up the world into 45 inhabited regions and gives projections for what will happen in each of those places. So now we're starting to know things that are more directly relevant to near-term decision-making about what to build, how to adapt to what's coming with sea level rise and increasing precipitation in some places and increasing drought in other places and extreme weather events, all the sorts of issues that climate change is going to cause for human societies now and in the future. I wanted to move on to a different question here that I know Katie will have a lot to say about because I've talked to her about it. It's about uncertainty in the reports. So this is one of the key features of these reports, is that they try to present scientific results along with the range of uncertainty that surrounds them. And this is really complex. That can be done in statistical language, with numbers and sigmas and lots of things that most people wouldn't understand at all. Or it can be done in qualitative language. And back in the 1990s, the IPCC decided to move toward a qualitative language. So we have different categories of certainty. There are things that are more likely than not. There are things that are likely, or very likely, or virtually certain. And each one of those terms reflects a statistical level of uncertainty. So, greater than 50%, greater than 66%, greater than 90%, over 95%, and so on. So, using words like that seems like it's getting more precise, and it is in a way, but you need to understand the connection between the qualitative term and the numerical range that's represented. And then on top of that, we have another category, which is confidence. So there's the uncertainty range, but then there's also the confidence level. And that's comprised of two components: how much evidence there is about something and how much agreement exists in the evidence. So you could have a situation where you have a lot of evidence about things like urban heat islands, but then you might also have low agreement about how well that the different pieces of evidence agree. And so that puts up a complicated situation. In the best case, you have a lot of evidence and a lot of agreement in the evidence, and then we have high confidence. But what do you do when we have medium evidence and low agreement? And there's a system for deciding things like that. But the point is that it creates two kinds of statements. We might have, very likely situation where we have only medium confidence in that very likely analysis. What are ordinary people supposed to do with language like that? And there have been a lot of studies of how to resolve that problem. I most recently saw this in a Bjorn Lomborg thing where he's sort of equating the confidence language with the uncertainty language and drawing the wrong conclusion from the two different kinds of language that are used. So anyway, it's been a constant debate within the IPCC. There's no great solution, especially when you're talking about things that have low likelihood. Low likelihood doesn't mean that event is impossible, it means that we think it's not as likely as something that's very likely. Anyway, Katie, I don't know what you want to say about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for raising that, Paul. And I hadn't even noted that question when you did, so I've been trying to go up and down here in the chat for the Q&A. I guess I'll just add two themes for uncertainty that feel very relevant. So how has uncertainty evolved in the treatment of it within the IPCC and more broadly across decision-making contexts as we increasingly move into the spaces of responses to climate happening now? Number one, on the adaptation side of things, increasing preparedness for impacts that are already happening. What we've seen, whether it's local governments, national governments, private sector, or IPCC assessment of all of the above, really has been tackling with that last category that Paul hit. What do you do when it's low or unknown likelihood and potentially high impact? And in this current assessment by the IPCC, there's been a real recognition that across the world, this has been accompanied by a lot of emphasis on what's called methods of decision-making under deep uncertainty. So how do you ensure that the best science can inform our long-term pathways, our sets of options, how we'll continue to make adjustments through time as the seas rise or as rainfall intensifies or heat increases, and recognizing that in many cases, we don't know the exact timing of onset of different categories of impacts. Sometimes we are being surprised and impacts are starting faster than we thought. In other cases, we just don't know in terms of some of the potential tipping points or kind of fundamental shifts in states of the climate or ecological systems when they might happen. And so I've been very excited to see the degree to which some of these best practices in the space of decision-making and decision support have been adopted into the assessment process, complementary to the ongoing IPCC approach to uncertainty, really geared towards making that knowledge relevant. On the mitigation side, on the side of reducing our emissions of heat-trapping gases, what we've also seen is a real emphasis on the risks relevant to decision-making. So there's a question here, why isn't the world acting faster? And in a way, the world is not acting faster because the responses to climate change itself also carry risks, which in some cases have been paralyzing for action. And so I think what we're seeing is a real recognition that to do assessment that speaks to the nature of decision-making challenges right now, there has to be a very strong look at not just the impacts of climate change, but the nuances and complexities of doing something about it.
I was going to jump back in and just say that because I missed this piece. Somebody had asked us to, I guess Elisa had asked us to talk about the major results from the most recent report. And I'll just say a couple of things. One thing is that we now have a very, first of all, we're calling climate change an established fact. Anthropogenic climate change is an established fact. That is as certain as science ever gets. We're not 100% sure, but we're at the sort of 99.5% certainty level about that now. A second thing is that we have reduced the uncertainty in the central estimate of how much climate change will happen at different levels of carbon dioxide. So all the previous reports gave a range of 1.5 to 4.5 degrees centigrade. So one had 2 to 5 degrees, but it's similar, about a 3-degree range of uncertainty about that result. This report says 2.5 to 4. So we have cut a whole degree off the bottom end of that range. And that means that, we're pretty clear that if carbon dioxide doubles in the atmosphere, we will reach 3 degrees of warming and possibly more. So that's an important result just because it kind of sets it reduces the possibility that we could be doing all this and having less effect on the climate than we thought. And then the last thing I'll say is that the relationship between carbon dioxide and climate change is pretty strictly linear right now. So we know that that's the major culprit. We also know that methane is about 10% of greenhouse gas caused climate change. That's good to know because methane is a relatively easy target and has a huge effect on you know, it only lasts 20 years in the atmosphere, while carbon dioxide lasts hundreds of years. So if we can cut methane emissions, we can have a big effect with relatively less effort, and it will show up sooner in the actual amount of climate change. So let me toss it back to you, Elisa, for whatever you want to do next.
Yeah, thank you so much for those responses. I know we're coming close to the end of our time here, so I want to make sure we get a few more questions in. One thing that I'm curious about is, you know, this week is a really important week in climate policy, with conversations happening at COP26 in Glasgow, as well as a vote today in the US House on Biden's Build Back Better agenda. And, you know, there's a lot of hope for some climate action coming out of that as well. So I'm wondering if you can comment on, I imagine you've been following these to some extent. What are your hopes for this? How does the IPCC report fit into this process? What do we need to make sure happens coming out of these climate conversations?
Okay, I can kick off with a few reflections. So yeah, COP26 is really a big meeting happening in Glasgow now. And in a way, it's kind of a next temperature check, literally and also figuratively, post-Paris Agreement. So I think a lot of the deliberations happening now are basically saying, for all the country pledges now on the table, called nationally determined contributions, you know, they don't add up to 2C. They're definitely above that, and much less 1.5C temperature increase as a goal. So, you know, what does it mean to ratchet, whether that's through the focus we have been seeing on methane or coal phase out, or deforestation, or electric vehicles, or renewables. And I think really, really important, relevant to some of the questions around kind of why is there not more happening? What do we know about kind of things that should be prescribed for societies? I think we're seeing just a ton of emphasis on how to do the things we already know how to do, technologically, economically in many cases, and really it's a matter of political will, avoiding some of the need to develop in the same way that we've done historically by making it viable globally. There, as the other pillar, will be a lot of ongoing focus on adaptation. We see kind of dedicated funds and approaches for both adaptation as it increases preparedness for communities as well as ecosystems, and kind of the bigger questions around loss and damage, which is a concept that means different things to different people, but can be used to get at the losses that can't be repaired, what this means to cultures, to low-lying island nations, to people who are disproportionately impacted and in most cases have hardly contributed to the challenge in terms of emissions of heat-trapping gases in the first place. Last two things I'd highlight, I think we're seeing a lot of attention to finance. The reason why there's so much attention to finance is kind of the inequity of who caused climate change in the first place as compared to who is bearing the impacts of climate change. Finance relevant to climate solutions comes from the public and the private sector. There's been this longstanding goal of getting towards 100 billion in climate finance across private and public sources per year by 2020, which we're not there yet. And I think there's real interest in intensifying efforts. And then finally, a lot that happens this week and next that is really crucial is kind of thinking about how to advance the functioning of the Paris Agreement, the Paris rulebook, really essential towards transparency and ambition, and even carbon markets and the different ways that action can be accelerated across governments, businesses, and the civil society. Domestically, a lot to be said as well, but maybe I'll hand over to Paul so I don't hog the last of our minutes here.
Well, I could talk a long time about this. I would just say that one of the most difficult things in Glasgow right now is that the US has gone in a relatively weak position because the climate policies of the Biden administration are stuck in Congress. And there's even a threat to the EPA carbon rule with lawsuits coming before the Supreme Court now. And that's very unfortunate because the US is holds the greatest historical responsibility for climate change. If you look at the total emissions over time, the US has much more than any other country, including China, even though China is emitting more right now than we are. We really hope, I really hope that we're able to project a sense that, regardless of the domestic situation, the Biden administration will continue to press for strong policies here, and that will be enough to, for other countries to believe that there is a leadership from the most responsible country in the world.
Fantastic, thank you. I think there's another great question that would be a nice one to end on, which is sort of on a more personal level. What was your background coming into this, and how do you think that the way that you think and write about climate issues has developed through being involved in this process? Yeah, and I think kind of adding on to that, sort of, what do you think about when you think about sort of the role of scientists in general in these conversations about climate and climate policy? And what should we be doing as scientists to really stress this effective communication to people beyond, the ivory tower of academia? Part of what our group does is sort of helping, as I said at the beginning, to encourage people to stand up against misinformation and, communicate effectively about the real scientific facts that we, pursue in our research. And so just commenting on this sort of more broadly, what can we do as scientists to, dispel misinformation and be a better role in this process?
Well, let me start with your first question about the personal level. For me, it was really I was really honored to be invited to join the IPCC because I'm a historian of science and technology primarily, and I've been studying climate science for more than 30 years. So there's a certain sense in which I've kind of become one by osmosis, but my background is not in the physical sciences. But I did write a book about climate models and climate data. And it was really a great experience, and my colleagues were all lovely and hardworking, and it was just a pleasure to work with them. So I felt like I fit right in, even though I was one of only 2 social scientists in working group 1. On the big question about science communication, when you poll people about climate change, most Americans say, yeah, they think it's happening and something should be done about it. So everybody's on board with the concept now, not everybody, but a lot of people. The problem is that if you then ask them, would you be willing to pay, an extra $1 a gallon at the gas pump for gasoline to help reduce this problem? They say no. So the big question is how to get from, I understand that there's a problem and we've got to do something about it, to who is going to pay and how. And I think the big thing to communicate is that, yes, there's going to be a cost, but if we work hard at it now, it won't even really be that much compared to how much we're going to have to spend later on adapting to the conditions that we're creating. So if we'd spent the amount of money that's in the Biden climate plan 30 years ago, we wouldn't be here today. We would be having a different conversation.
Great. And given where we are with the time, I will give my Cliff Notes answer to something that could be a very long answer. So I was a PhD student at Stanford looking at coastal environments based at Hopkins Marine Station, combining engineering and ecology to think about how the changing climate impacts ecosystems. And while a PhD student, I loved the process and the program, but I will admit that I had a bit of a quarter life crisis right around that 25-year of age mark, where I just realized that the work I was doing was like deliberately cutting people out of the picture. And in a way, when I was looking at these ecosystems, people were the biggest modulator of the impacts occurring now and the prospects for the vitality of those ecosystems into the future. So I thought I was leaving academia forever when I joined the IPCC as a postdoc and then co-director and director of science. But those years in the end ended up being just totally profound and transformational in helping me rethink the state of science, the mode of interaction that scientists can engage in. And once I finished the IPCC with hundreds of colleagues, they all said you need to do informational interviews to figure out what to do with your career. So I talked to people across every possible science policy context and realized that actually I was pretty academic after all. But then headed back into academia with a totally reworked approach to climate change adaptation science, to this point around communications, where communications and engagement with stakeholders are part of the research process. So I'm deeply grateful for that experience at that time, and the different ways that all these science society interactions shape each one of us in terms of the approach that we're taking.
Thank you for that wonderful and perhaps slightly over speeded response there.
Sorry for the rapid talking.
I think that's a fantastic way to end this event here today. Thank you both so much again for joining us, and everybody in the audience for being here. I just want to finish up by making an announcement about a couple of other upcoming events that we have with Scientists Speak Up. There is going to be another webinar next week on denialism, tying in, oops, sorry about that, both climate change and COVID. Oh, having trouble with some screen sharing here. Okay. And then a disinformation workshop. So thinking about tools that we can apply to combat disinformation, happening the week after. So stay tuned for that, and join us. If you want to join our mailing list, you can go to our website, Scientists Speak Up at Stanford, and sign yourself up there. But thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Elisa. This is really great.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.